everybody, and thanks a lot for the kind invitation. It's also an opportunity for me to be back to an in-person meeting of this size after a couple of years, of course. So this is also, let's say, an added value of being here today. So I was given a quite daunting task to speak about regulatory needs in AI for research. This is a particularly complex topic because there is not one thing as one unique regulatory framework for the use of AI in medicine, let alone in biomedical research. It's a field that is evolving technically, and therefore it's evolving also at the level of regulation. But regulatory sources, this is my take-home message, I could actually just stop here. Regulatory sources are multiple. So there are different sources of governance and regulation that are emerging in a very dispersed and rather uncoordinated way. And of course, in 20 minutes, I don't have time to cover the full spectrum of that, but I will give you some examples of how things are moving in this space. So, let's see if I can do my pointer here. Okay, so this space is characterized by some fundamental ambiguities. It's not entirely decided what distinguishes a normal algorithm, a classical algorithm, which is just a sequence of instruction, from an artificial intelligence algorithm. There are very many ways to characterize this distinction, but when it comes to the most used form of artificial intelligence these days, that is machine learning, we move beyond the usual paradigm of an input, a process, and an output. Actually, the most striking characteristic of machine learning is that these algorithms learn to perform, learn the process that they need to perform a task. They learn them by themselves. That's why this is called machine learning. Whether we are talking of supervised machine learning, that is the case in which researchers or developers give to the machine examples of the kind of tasks that the machine has to learn, or whether we are talking about unsupervised machine learning, where the algorithm learns itself to make classifications out of raw data, it's very complex, the end result. In particular, because there are things that we were not used to have before. So, and in particular, the fact that we don't have access to the process that the machine has learned. So we know that the machine has learned to perform something, but we don't know what happens inside the machine. We don't know the instructions that the machine is learning. This is why we speak of a hidden layer in machine intelligence or machine learning algorithms. This is reflected in the ethical discussion about machine learning in medicine that, as we have just heard, is pretty broad. There are issues of privacy, issues of consent, issues of data fairness or data quality, issues of liability, as we just heard, and issues of explainability that has to do with how do we explain the behavior of an algorithm if we do not have access to this hidden layer of instruction? So how do we explain what the machine is doing? So I want to highlight a few of those issues from a regulatory point of view, and this will bring us to discuss the emerging regulatory issues. This is a book chapter that we wrote a couple of years ago that reviews, so to say, the emerging ethical issues around biomedical research, clinical use of AI, and public health. So there are many ways in which data can be used at the research level. For example, these are just examples of many possible uses. We can leverage electronic health records to find relevant correlations in existing health data to, for example, optimize the provision of healthcare. but whether it is legally and ethically acceptable to factor in those kind of experiments, the ethnic background of the patients or their socioeconomic status, it's an open question. So it's a question that is not yet been answered in full. There are obviously other examples. For example, many are trying to develop machine learning algorithms to improve drug design. So to predict which molecular structures are more likely to hit their targets in the human body. Or others are using artificial intelligence to actually discover what molecules could be useful for a given pathology. So this is all very promising from a research point of view. But the discussion is very much advanced on whether it is conceivable to do these things with algorithms that we cannot understand, so algorithms that cannot be explained. So it looks like trial and error. No, it looks like the machine is learning from trying to match, let's say, the bullet and the target. From a statistical point of view, but we don't know the mechanistic reasons why, for example, drugs might work for a given disease. So there are ways to design these algorithms in such a way that the explainability part, the opacity of the algorithms can be dispelled. So there are efforts, technical efforts in making those algorithms explainable, that is to say, decipher what the algorithm is doing, making sense of the set of instructions that the algorithm is discovering. I will go back to this later on. Of course, there are dual use issues around this kind of research, and Switzerland is the hub of also study of dual use issues also in artificial intelligence. There are other ways to leverage health data for healthcare related purposes. For example, we might, as I said before, study electronic health records with the aim of reducing healthcare costs, or we might develop algorithms that can predict which patients, as you see here on the right, which patients is more likely to benefit from treatment, okay? So this is great, but if the aim of this is mostly to reduce healthcare costs, then we have to question whether this is compatible with the aims, with the more general aims of medicine. So this is just a brief initial overview to tell you that indeed, it looks that the ethical stakes of artificial intelligence expand the scope of ethics as we know it, ethics of research as we know it, as it has been formalized in the 70s in the Belmont report. So we have these nice principles that still apply, as Susanne very clearly showed, but there seems to be also more. So let's see what is more at stake and how regulation is trying to address that. So one very prominent issue is algorithmic bias. Algorithmic bias means that an algorithm is fed with data that is biased. For example, it overrepresents male patients or patients of Caucasian origin, and therefore it doesn't work exactly well for, in this case, women or patients of color. We have seen many examples of this kind of medical algorithms. So those algorithms reflect existing social and economic inequalities and perpetuate them in clinical practice, and this is a problem. It's a problem that can be due either to algorithmic bias or to excessive variance in the data set, meaning that data quality matters in a number of different ways. Then, as I said, I'm gonna move a little bit fast here. Then, as I said, there is the problem of explainability. How can we trust an algorithm that produces a result, but we don't know how actually this is attained? So we say that these algorithms are opaque, meaning that it is either impossible to access their instruction, or even if it were possible to read what the algorithm is doing, it is impossible to make sense because the complexity of this instruction, the sheer statistical complexity of this instruction is just out of reach for human comprehension. People are asking themselves whether this way of resolving a task, for example, in the context of research, this way of producing evidence in favor or against the use of a certain drug, for example, is not necessarily compatible with the idea of clinical responsibility or scientific responsibility, scientific integrity. If we think about it, a medical act is a very complex act, and so is a scientific act, so to say, that has to do with having justifying reasons to do what one is doing. So science is just not trial and error, and medicine is not either. So it seems that there are many complex factors that make a medical act justified. And the risk here is that artificial intelligence might jeopardize the rightfulness of medical acts or scientific acts. There are a number of trade-offs here, but I won't focus on that. So especially because of this possible impact of artificial intelligence in medicine, regulators are developing instruments to come to terms with these specificities of this field. From a regulatory point of view, artificial intelligence, as I said at the onset, is not a unified field. It's a field that includes pharma regulation, medical device regulation, the emerging field of digital health ethics more in general. So it's a blend of different regulatory sources. And we have seen that legislators are trying to enter in this broad field. For example, when mobile app to do digital contact tracing emerged in 2020, a lot of countries, including Switzerland, legislated to make the use of those apps possible, okay? The same happened with vaccine certification apps, no? This is the European example. I could have shown example from other countries. There are binding regulations that make the use of these new digital tools possible. And something similar is happening in the domain of AI. For example, the General Data Protection Regulation has some provisions, very difficult to interpret, I have to say, but it has some provisions about explainability. So it requires that when a decision is fully automated through the use of AI, the users need to be informed at least about the general logic of the algorithm. What does it mean in practice? I cannot answer this question because we haven't still seen this being enforced. So it's actually not very clear what these regulations imply. And the new AI Act, the new AI regulation at the level of the European Union that has been proposed, it's under discussion now, classifies all medical devices that use AI as high-risk systems. I think this is stretched. I mean, it might be that we have medical devices that do not pose excessive risk to patients, but nevertheless, if you're developing these kind of tools, you have to take that into account. And also the new AI Act asks for transparency. It asks for the operation of the AI systems to be intelligible to the users. What does it mean in practice? Again, it's not entirely clear. Now, it's obvious that regulators are trying to address the fact that there is amazing science happening in this space. Like in this example, you can predict cardiovascular risk by looking at images of the eye of the patient. But actually, the researchers themselves do not know why those images should contain information about cardiovascular risk. They just find a correlation, but they cannot explain the causation. So, as I said, there are ways to dispel the opacity. Researchers are working on that. So the researchers are working especially on ways to explain algorithms ex post. We don't have time to look into the technical details, but heat maps are an example. So here, in this way, there is an algorithm that interprets the behavior of the primary algorithm. by showing which areas of an image the machine learning is taking mostly into account. But many believe that we shouldn't have full faith in the capacity of science to explain algorithms ex post. Of course, this is an open issue. I've put a couple of references here, and for those of you who are curious about this specific topic. There are other forms of governance, though, that are not technical, but rather institutional. Another example in Europe, but I could make one in Switzerland as well, is the emergence of the European health data space, which is a common space of health data that become accessible, highly accessible to all participating members, so as to create a common baseline for the development of AI, for example. This is very interesting. We have something similar in Europe, in Switzerland. The Swiss Personalized Health Network is an infrastructure of this kind, and it tries to develop governance through institutional standards. Very interesting case of another different form of regulation. Clinical validation of AI algorithm is currently a problem because only a minority of approved AI tools have gone through randomized controlled trials. I'm not saying that they should, I'm just noticing that they don't. So it's an open question whether a randomized controlled trial should also be the gold standard for AI. If you want my personal view, I think that they should, but that's that it's up for discussion. A final point that I would like to highlight here is the fact that in the case, for example, of diabetic retinopathy, it makes perfect sense to tell the algorithm, okay, look at the pictures of the eye and try to understand whether the patient has a disease or not. But in other cases, those choices that are research choices to begin with are less clear. For example, in the case of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, trying to develop an algorithm that gauges a diagnosis from brain images is not entirely obvious because we are not aware medically of any brain abnormality that correlates with this particular disease. It's just an example, of course. So we should always be able to question whether the way in which research frames a research question driven by AI is scientifically valid. Okay, now really towards the end of my talk, I would just like to highlight that the FDA is producing a risk-based approach to the regulation of AI products in the health space. But this approach distinguishes between different levels of risk. So it's very different from the European approach. It's a way of grading risks according to uses and medical conditions. And at the same time, the FDA is developing this pre-certification program. So the FDA assesses the quality of the developer before assessing the quality of the product, okay? And it regulates the level of oversight according to the quality of this assessment. So this is just a few other references on the regulatory trends in the US. Now, I want to finish with my last slide here. The take-home message from my presentation is that there are different sources of regulation that are being developed these days around AI for research purposes and for clinical purposes. There are institutional forms of governance. There are more engineering ethics forms of regulation. There are collaborative attempts at the level of healthcare institutions that are taking place. There are legal initiatives. And finally, there are more regulatory affairs initiatives like the one that we have seen with the FDA. So it's a field in evolution, and it's a field that we need to keep an eye on. And it's very difficult to predict where the field is heading from a regulatory point of view, but I would be more than happy to discuss that with you in the Q&A. Thank you very much.